transforming an opportunity into a success and a wonderful occasion. I met Kevin Clements when he was the director of ICA. It was a few years ago. We were all younger and a little less white hair. But the place was really bubbling, was very lively. And I was very impressed by the way they were approaching things. I was invited by Kevin to a conversation with Chris Mitchell, and then I went to a class taught by a guy called Rich Rubenstein. And he was speaking about religion. And I was coming from Italy, I was coming from Europe, I had certain idea, and I was fascinated by the idea that you could have such a program in, I learned my class from Kevin, I went to Columbia University, started a program there, and lo and behold, I was invited to come back here, this time as professor and then as director and dean. But I'm particularly happy to have Kevin back today here with Dennis Sandoli, because Dennis Sandoli is the first professor who taught conflict resolution at the center, then the institute, then the school, and has been a witness to this incredible transformation of ESCAR in 30 years. 30 years, can be not that much institutionally. If you look at the Catholic Church or the American political institutions, but are a significant portion and a very, very major portion for the field of conflict analysis resolution as an academic enterprise. And so what I'm really eager to welcome here is not only the two presenters and speakers, but also this very tradition that they embody. A tradition that is becoming increasingly global. Happy that Terence Lyons is here, linking us with the global commitment of Mason. But I think that it's really an invitation to all of us. It's good to know that you can start something very, very small, almost improbable, and then make it grow, make it better, make it strong, so that people pay attention and learn from it. So welcome Kevin, welcome Dennis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Bartoli, Andrea. It's always pleasant to hear your introductory comments praising the school of which you are the first dean. And introducing one of our former directors, Professor Dr. Kevin Clements, to make a presentation about an area that the U.S. government is officially pivoting toward as we speak, an area where the drums of war are rolling between Japan and China over uninhabited islands called the Senkaku Island. The Chinese, this goes back to 1895 at least, so Kevin's presence here is very noteworthy. It's an honor to introduce him beyond Andrea's comments. And as part of that, let me just give you some information that you may or may not be aware of. Kevin Clements is currently Foundation Chair of Peace and Conflict Studies and Director of the New Zealand National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Otago, Dunedin, New Zealand. New Zealand, of course, is close to what we call down under. Affectionately, I think Kevin has heard the expression Kiwi, but we won't get into that any further. Before becoming the Foundation Chair in the University of Otago, Kevin held a similar position as Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies and Foundation Director of the Australian Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Queensland, Brisbane, Australia. Thank you. I got my voice, as if it weren't operatic enough. And before Kevin Clements went to Brisbane, Australia, I have to butter myself on. I am not a Luddite, just a bit behind the times. Prior to going to Australia, before he went to New Zealand, Kevin Clements was Secretary General of one of the world's premier NGOs, in conflict resolution, conflict transformation, international law. He was Secretary General in London for a number of years, and prior to that, he was art director here at what was then the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, ICAR, and he's held a number of positions before he came here. So Professor Dr. Kevin Clements has a global, distinguished legacy that has helped bring him to us here today to talk about some very important issues in a geostrategically significant part of the planet. Kevin, welcome back, welcome home.
Thank you, Dennis. I hope you don't mind me being here because I've actually sort of modified my talk a little bit from what it was, so I just want to sort of keep some sort of track on the notes. And it's a great pleasure to be back here and to see some of my old colleagues, Terry and John and Dennis and others, so, and Andrea. Thank you for inviting me and taking advantage of my short stop in Washington to come. And I want to talk about prospects for peace in the Asia Pacific region, partly because I live there, partly because it is going to become increasingly a kind of focus of world opinion and attention. And as Dennis said, it's also now a new pivot of US foreign policy. Some of you may have read the United States Defense Strategy document called very humbly, Maintaining US Global Leadership in the 21st Century. And a good deal of that document had to do with maintaining US supremacy, or reorienting US interests towards and maintaining US supremacy in the region. And I want to look at some of the sort of pros and cons of that and whether or not it's likely to result in generate stable peace. And some of you who may remember me may have thought that I had a kind of permanent aversion to statistics and things like that when I was here. Since being away, I've rediscovered how valuable they are. So some of this is going to be slightly statistical, and then I'll kind of wax philosophical at the end of it all. The first is just to kind of situate what you already know, which is that the numbers of violent conflicts around the world, according to Uppsala and so forth, are diminishing very dramatically. Interstate conflicts have almost completely disappeared, and intrastate conflicts are where it's at. But if you look at East Asia and the rest of the world, you see something interesting as well. I mean, East Asia has been, in terms of conflicts between states, has been relatively peaceful since 1988. I mean, that's the kind of this era here. And you can see that, in fact, there's almost been no instance whatsoever of an interstate conflict. You get a bubble, a little bit of a kind of a green line here around Thailand and Cambodia. But apart from that, there's been a kind of remarkable amount of stability in the region, and from being a kind of a war-torn region with extraordinarily high casualty rates in the 50s and 60s, I mean, phenomenal rates when you start thinking of, and 70s, when you add in the Cambodian genocide and so forth, it's been relatively peaceful. I mean, some notable exceptions on the Thai-Myanmar-Burmese border and on the Thai-Cambodian border, and within Thailand itself, there are kind of, there's quite a lot of violent conflict which kind of qualifies to be represented in the database. But in terms of Northeast Asia and so forth, despite the fact that North Korea insists on doing silly things like shooting missiles up into the air and testing atomic weapons, by and large, the region has been remarkably stable. So how to explain this? I mean, there are sort of three stock explanations for this. I mean, the democratic peace theory, which suggests that democracies don't go to war against each other. I mean, that's Russell's theory. Peace through world law, expanding international regimes, and the proactive role of the UN. And peace through trade or peace through free trade. There's some interesting arguments here around whether it's just trade alone or whether it's free trade, which is a kind of a critical driver of peacefulness and stability. And so one of the arguments is that the extraordinary last sort of 25 years of relative peacefulness in Northeast Asia at least has to do with an expansion of trade. I mean, so I'm on a research project with Stein Tønnesen and others at Uppsala on the East Asian peace. And they got a huge amount of money from a Norwegian bank to demonstrate that the values of free trade and the neoliberal agenda. I have to say I'm among the most skeptical of the group. I mean, in the sense that I'm not at all persuaded. I mean, I think I can be persuaded that this is driving some of the peacefulness in Northeast Asia. I'm not persuaded that it's going to result in stable peace in Northeast Asia. So the capitalist peace argument is that when societies choose capitalist economic growth and open markets, they diminish the power of domestic groups who might choose war and can't be bellicose with their neighbours if they wish to grow economically. And that explains East Asian negative peace, since the other two theories don't. I mean, it's clearly not democracy which is driving the peace in Northeast Asia. And so the argument is that when China chose growth and nationalist ideology over communism, it became more internationally peaceful, as did Vietnam. And then when Deng Xiaoping started his economic reforms in '79 and opened up foreign trade, he cited the trade and exploration exploits of Admiral Zheng He, and reminded the hardliners that when China had engaged with the world, it had been strong, and when in the 16th century it closed off the wall, it began a decline that ended 150 years with 150 years of humiliating invasion, colonization, and exploitation by stronger nations. So, you know, right throughout Chinese history, there's been this kind of ongoing debate, really, about whether or not openness or closedness is going to be most beneficial towards Chinese growth and development. And certainly, you can make an argument that the kind of, you know, that the period of the bamboo curtain and so forth, you know, when China was deliberately cut off from the rest of the world by Western nations and cut itself off to some extent by its own activities. Then you know, internally it was more unstable, and certainly in terms of growth and development, it was nowhere near as prominent as it is today. So if we just, this is where I'm kind of getting into some stats here. So oops, wait a minute. I'm doing two things. So China's now the second largest economy in the world. It's replaced Japan. And its growth rate's been pretty extraordinary. From 1980 to 2010, its economy grew 18-fold, an annual average of 10% per year. It's been the world's largest economy since 2002 in purchasing power per capita. And according to IMF forecasts, it's going to overtake the United States in 2016. So it does represent a formidable economic driver. Of course, the downside of this is that, you know, clean water is at a premium, and pollution levels are god almighty high, and there are all kinds of internal dynamics which I think threaten to unravel some of this miraculous growth. But at the moment, I mean, it's a bit like the dark satanic mills in the United Kingdom during the period of industrialization. When London smogs killed regularly sort of 200 or 300 people every time they hit. China's in that boat, and you can see what's happening. I mean, the United States economy is not going anywhere fast at the moment. So if you look at, and then if you look at the competition between China and Japan, I mean, GDP growth for China and Japan, I mean, it looks as though there's a kind of a crisis. China is about to eclipse Japan. In fact, in some extent, it has now slightly eclipsed Japan. And this is generating in Japan a kind of a huge feeling of inferiority. You know, because as long as Japan was, you know, leading the world economically, as long as people were trying to kind of discover the pros and cons of the Japanese miracle, then Japan could sort of feel reasonably comfortable and confident about its place in East Asia, its place in the world, and in its ability to overcome some of that kind of Second World War legacy and so forth. But if you look at if you look at this sort of GDP growth, I mean, it looks as though there's a fierce and intense competition. However, if you look at per capita in Japan and China, it looks like an opportunity. Japan is still, you know, a hugely wealthy economy, and the GDP per capita is $40,000 per year in Japan, and it's about sort of $4,900, $5,000 in China. So that represents a kind of an opportunity, therefore, to kind of focus some attention on justice issues, on equity issues, and equality issues. I think this is the secret to some of my subsequent argument here around how we might begin thinking, through some ways in which you kind of begin addressing domestic issues in order to maintain some degree of stability in the face of a lot of the national chauvinism. I didn't need to go through these things here, but let me just give you some indication of what's happening to GDP in the rest of Southeast Asia. Indonesia is jumping ahead. Thailand used to be Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and PDR, and Myanmar are kind of sort of languishing. But by and large, you can see that in terms of Southeast Asia and East Asia as a growth region, I mean, Indonesia, Japan, China, South Korea, and so forth are there. But I mean, in Southeast Asia, that's what's happening, kind of growth patterns. And the GDP per capita in Southeast Asia, I mean, Singapore's way up there again, sort of, over after 40,000, dropping a little bit. But you can see again that, there are sort of huge discrepancies within the region in terms of GDP per capita and in terms of purchasing power and so forth. The economic ties, I just want to sort of focus a little bit between China and Japan. I mean, these have seen unprecedented growth. So China is now Japan's largest trading partner. Imports from China exceed those of the US. China is the second largest trading partner. China's second largest trading partner is Japan, coming after the US. Japan's total trade with China was, $181 billion. The total trade is $345 billion. Japan's direct investment to China was $6.3 billion. China was Japan's #1 international tourist destination in 2011. I mean, 3.65 million Japanese visited China, and China sent 1 million visitors to Japan. So you might think on the basis of those kinds of figures that there's a lot of people contact, there's a lot of very, very dense economic exchange and trading exchange and dense financial linkages between China and Japan. And that these things, if the capitalist peace theory is right, ought to be guaranteeing high levels of stability. Because the capitalist peace theory says, free trade between both countries should mean that China and Japan will kind of see and identify these economic interests, and that they will then transcend any political differences that may occur. Oh, sorry, I've got some things here on level of military expenditure. If you don't know, well, maybe I should just show you this, because the U.S. pivot towards Asia is based to some extent, again, on kind of deep U.S. anxiety about not only China's role as an emerging economic power, but it's also based on the so-called increase in defense expenditure in China. You probably can't read this very clearly here, but this big column here is the United Kingdom and the United States together in terms of military expenditure. As you know, the United States accounts for 47.5% of the world's military expenditure. Add a bit to that from the UK, and you've got sort of over $700 billion worth of expenditure. And this is the whole of East Asia and Southeast Asia taken together. And this is China here, which has got about $100 million worth of defense expenditure. So when you kind of start asking about, where's the beef here in terms of the pivot? In terms of threat capacity, coercive capacity, and military power, there's absolutely no doubt at all who's got the numerical majority. I mean, this is just stupid stuff to think of, China flexing its muscle and adding to its economic kind of expansion with any sort of imperial intent or expansion. And China is giving no evidence whatsoever that it's kind of, it wishes to secure or guarantee its economic interests anywhere in the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, wherever it is, and it's all over the world, by military means. So insofar as the US pivot towards Asia is aimed at what I think it is, which is a sort of a new neo-containment policy of China, I'm very cynical, for example. I mean, I'm very pleased that the US has now recognized Myanmar, Burma, and that other Western countries have as well, and that sanctions are about to be removed. But it did happen to coincide with this new containment policy, and countering China's, and it also it happened to emerge at exactly the same time when Burma, Myanmar was having deep problems with China. And then America saw an opportunity there to both kind of work with human rights and open it up, but also to kind of begin consolidating some sort of strategic interest in Burma and in Bangladesh and in India and in Nepal. So I think these are very interesting issues that need to be. And okay, so military expenditure again, this is just showing that China is nowhere near the USA. But then in terms of Human Development Index, I mean, what you see again, the China line here is this one here. So in terms of all of the indicators, education, literacy, health and well-being, you can see that China is still in formation. It's not addressing a lot. It's not addressing a lot of its own internal problems here. A lot of Chinese wealth is not going to kind of breaking down rural-urban distinctions. It's not going to ensuring kind of mass literacy and health and well-being. There's still a long way to go, and indeed there's a big and active debates right now, as you know, between within China on how to do this. I mean, if you take distribution of family income, which is another guide to all of this, I mean, China's right in the middle there. Thailand, Hong Kong, Singapore, very, very, very kind of unequal in terms of income levels. Fortunately, New Zealand's right down there, relatively equal still. Taiwan, South Korea takes top billing there in terms of the most equal in terms of income equality in East and Southeast Asia. But this is also why I'm building up a case here. If you take Chinese satisfaction surveys, one of the interesting things. So if you look at some of the things that China might be worried about, or we ought to be worried about, in terms of GDP per capita, in terms of income equality, in terms of rural-urban things. These are percentage of citizens relatively satisfied or extremely satisfied with government. And you can see that if you're living in Shanghai or Beijing, you're pretty happy, which sort of confirms all of the structural theories of imperialism, that elite groups and economic and political elites in capital cities and in major metropolitan centers, are likely to feel relatively happy with a kind of an open free trade policy which enables them to go to London or New York or anywhere around the world. This is sort of provincial level. There's certain degrees of happiness, slight increase to 2009. At the district and county level, I mean, you're getting slightly lower ones, but at the level of township and village, which is where the bulk of the billion population lives, the dissatisfaction levels are quite high. So 60% would say they're happy, but it's been fluctuating. So the question I want to pose then is, what happens when growth slows? Wealthy, relatively equal countries, I think, have got a capacity to withstand external shocks. Wealthy, unequal countries, I think, don't have that capacity and will be subject to more internal pressures and probably violent conflict. And growth based on hyper-exploitation of non-renewable resources is, by definition, unsustainable. So my thesis really is that negative peace in East and Southeast Asia is precarious, and it's going to change if growth stops or falters. So that's the argument. And that growth will stop or falter for a whole variety of reasons. It could be external demand diminishing, it could be kind of resource constraints, it could be a recognition that the negative externalities of Chinese development are just too adverse and too difficult to sustain. Whatever it is, if it starts to slow, then I think that some of the internal contradictions within the Chinese economy are likely to kind of manifest themselves. And if you think about the other side of the equation in terms of stable peace, conditions have slowed in Japan. I mean, there's been sort of very little or no growth in Japan for the last decade. And one of the consequences of that, I want to argue, is that the domestic divisions within Japan have become much more apparent and manifest in terms of anxiety around Japanese identity, Japan's place in East Asia and Southeast Asia, and Japan's place in the world. So I think that there are sort of arguments here around kind of gains to be made from cooperation and competition. I'd say economic problems in the global financial crisis are driving collaboration, but it's not the same as intentional cooperation to solve the multiplicity of social, economic, and political problems confronting the region and the world. And so what I want to argue is we can only sort of avoid rivalry by strengthening regional and global institutions and reducing horizontal and vertical inequality in each Asian state. I mean, that's basically the argument I want to kind of start developing. So what do security specialists say are the threats? So tensions remain pretty high up, very explosive bilateral disputes in 2010, and certainly after last year's spats over the Senkaku Island and the Diaoyutai Islands with South Korea, and also certain Chinese kind of anxiety, generating a certain amount of anxiety with the Spratly Nanshas. So these little rocks, which have one level would seem to be trivial in terms of triggering conflicts, I mean, are generating some very kind of important fault lines. I would argue not necessarily in terms of interstate rivalry, but they're becoming critical fault lines in terms of dealing with domestic discontent for different sorts of reasons. There are two different dynamics at work in China and in Japan. And so I just want to kind of explore some of these a bit. So there are sort of some real tension points. There's stalling growth in Japan. There's rising inequality, sort of urban, rural China. There's climate change, natural disasters, and water-based conflict, and China's been afflicted with another round of appalling floods and so forth this year. There's sort of strong sense of environmental, certainly at the level of pollution, unsustainability. There's very little commitment in the region to what we might think of as human security. We can get into this in some detail later on. Too much emphasis on national security, narrowly conceived in 20th century terms. And then these unresolved tensions, Spratly Nansha, Thai, Cambodia, North South Korea, Senkaku Diaoyutai, Kurils, and the Dokdo Takashima. Okay, so I wanted to sort of focus on Senkaku Diaoyu. And just remind you what happened last year. I mean, 80,000 Chinese citizens staged anti-Japan rallies to protest in over 50 cities, which was the largest since 1972 when normalization of diplomatic ties occurred. So 80,000 people being mobilized against Japan's corporate interests in China was quite a few last year. There's a big debate about whether or not this was sort of manipulated by the government, whether it was spontaneous, or whether it was a combination of manipulation and spontaneity, but it was certainly big demonstrations. And that sort of seems to contradict that solid official exchange and economic cooperation and the high level of interdependence between the Chinese and Japanese economies. And Japan's trade with China continues to rise. And the kind of increased tension around these issues, really challenges the neoliberal assumptions about economic interdependence, restraining the conflict. Dennis wrote a nice little thing in the Financial Times, which he was suggesting that there's the Chinese and Japanese decision makers have had a rush of blood to their head, and it's time to sort of step back. And to some extent, there is some stepping back from these issues at the moment. Well, I have to say that the head of Komeito, which is the Liberal Party's prime partner, went to Japan about 2 weeks ago. The Chinese government's position with this representative from the current government in Japan was that Japan should let things simmer, let things settle down, and not raise any, not surface this issue any higher, but it needs to be surfaced. This message was delivered to Abe. Abe says we have no intention of letting this simmer down. It's in Japan that we have an advantageous negotiating position at the moment, and this is important. I mean, he feels that he has a domestic political mandate for prosecuting Senkaku Diaoyutai nationalist aspiration. We've got a kind of a sort of, so we now have a kind of very interesting contradiction to what happened with the, with the trade connection. Japanese public opinion, 84.3% of Japanese public had negative views of China last year, which was higher than the previous record of 78.3% in 2011. And the reasons for Japanese public opinion's negative views is that 54.4% thought that China's self-centered behavior was trying to secure natural energy sources. This was a bit rich coming from Japan, which has spent a good deal of its existence post-Second World War trying to secure exactly the same resources. 48%, nearly half the population, said that China was the malign party in the Senkaku Island dispute. But there's a mirror image on the other side. Chinese public opinion, 64.5%, even more than in Japan, of the Chinese public had very negative views of Japan, which was a slight improvement from the 65.9% in 2011, which was a little bit unusual given the fact that the conflict heated up. And the reasons for Chinese negative views was the past war history and the fact that Japan failed to admit its war of aggression towards China. So you have a kind of an interesting phenomenon here where Japanese and Chinese public opinion seems to be running in quite an opposite direction from the economic and industrial and trading and financial exchanges that are taking place between China and Japan. All of these polls are consistent with polls that were done earlier in 2002. The Asahi Shimbun and Academy of Sciences revealed then that 40% of Chinese felt that Japanese felt that Chinese didn't have any mutual understanding of their position. They had very different political systems. 80% of Chinese were particularly taken with this issue of historic memory and visits to the Yakusuni Shrine and the revision of Japanese history textbooks. And the number one public image of the Japanese in China was as an aggressor. This label has proven extraordinarily difficult for Japan to throw off, even sort of 66 years after the war, 67 years after the war. And it just sort of underlines what we know from Van Vulcan and others, that powerful collective memories, whether real or concocted, can be at the root of cultural identities, prejudice, and xenophobic nationalism. And once you've chosen a trauma, the historical truth doesn't matter. In the conflict situation, the leader evokes the memory of the chosen trauma together with the chosen glory to galvanize the group. So in China, you have, revolutionary memories and the defeat of the Japanese armies and so forth, and they carry in China that mental representation of a traumatic event with all the hurt and shame that goes with it. So modern China's national identity can be characterized by the victimhood narrative at the same time as it's economically ascendant. I mean, this is the interesting piece. I mean, it's about to eclipse the United States in terms of economic growth and development. So why it should feel that it's a victim, 68 years after the war is an interesting question. And Japan, feels that the Chinese are kind of, completely misplaced about all of this as well, they're kind of caught again in what's called, what's increasingly called the Japanese renationalizing. So whereas immediately post-war, my generation of Japanese, I mean those who were in their early 60s, you know, whereas there was a willingness to kind of seek some measure of, you know, forgiveness for atrocity, that actually is beginning to change. So in the 1980s, you know, wartime responsibility was a divisive issue between the liberal media siding with the Chinese, this is in Japan, versus conservatives denouncing them. And recently, most articles in the Japanese media attribute Chinese and Korean protests to, quote, populist manipulation by the government. Public sees the problem as not Japan, but the irresponsible political leaderships of China and Korea. And Japanese should no longer be pushed around and instead should try to reclaim their rights denied by pressures of foreign powers and leftists at home. And then that's also playing into this notion of a reclamation of the glory of Japanese history, going back not only to 1895, but to the earlier kinds of you know, glory times. So there is a renationalizing in Japan, which has to do with its kind of attempt to really grapple with this notion that it's being slightly eclipsed. I mean, it's still a hugely powerful economy. I mean, hegemonically powerful in the Asia-Pacific region, and yet it feels, you know, completely incapacitated, or kind of partly incapacitated. So this whole notion of this renationalizing, I think, is kind of an important piece of the puzzle here. And then the other thing that's happening is that, you know, in terms of setting to rest the war, I mean, you know, Japanese newspaper polls say that Japanese are not opposed to Kazumi's visits to the shrine and not opposed to Abe's visits to the shrine, even if it incenses the Chinese. And there's a growing desire to honor Japanese war dead. So you have a kind of a curious situation here where you know, the war is over, but there is a kind of a, you know, a desire to now begin revisiting, you know, whether this war was in fact a war of aggression, or whether, and it's, you know, the old tropes about it being a war of liberation are coming out again. So they're saying, you know, this wasn't a kind of an imperial war on the part of Japan. It was a war basically to kind of help Asian independence movements liberate, you know, their territories from French and British colonial and Dutch rule. So this is kind of an astonishing sort of trope to come out in the middle of the beginning of the 21st century. So there are two kinds of problems here again, which is, you know, these are the Balkan problems, which is how does Japan mourn its dead without seeking to justify or glorify the war, which would just incense the Chinese even further. And there is a kind of another big challenge here, which is why, given Chinese, you know, surging, you know, economic hegemony, is there so much anxiety about, you know, Japan and seeking, you know, more convincing reparations, more convincing statements of forgiveness, and so forth from the Japanese. And I think this is one of the kind of big challenges that we're sort of looking at here. So we've got a situation where many Asian states are still in this post-independence nation-building phase, and so nationalism still has wide currency here, even though in Europe and elsewhere nationalism is being muted, you know, considerably by regional organization. The regional security architecture is biased towards the status quo and timid. The United Nations is somewhat marginalized in a lot of these initiatives, although I was with Helen Clark at UNDP yesterday, and she said that China is taking a very active role on the development side of the UNDP, but they don't want to kind of take any active side on governance or on crisis prevention or on conflict management or on conflict transformation. And much of the peace and security work of ASEAN is sort of oriented towards, I think, kind of quite improbable threat. So if you look then at the kind of, you know, the security architecture, I mean, this is what exists. There's SARC in South Asia and so forth, which we can leave on one side. There's ASEAN, which is quietly sort of doing its thing, but even there's a huge reluctance to engage some of these political issues that lie at the heart of you know, kind of current disputes. There's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that links up China, Russia. There's the Pacific Island Forum that links up Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, and a range of Pacific Island countries. There's the ASEAN +3, which includes Japan, China, and then there's the Asian Defense Ministers ministerial meetings, which includes a much wider number of people here. But even with all of this security architecture, and there's APEC sort of out on the side, even with the security architecture, I think you can make the argument that the particular drivers of this sort of intense antagonism between China and Japan, are not going to be constrained by the existing institutional arrangements. They're just too big, and they're too strategically significant. And the United States, in relation to both of them, is caught between a rock and a hard place. And in Southeast Asia, there's a sort of a huge neuralgia to doing sort of anything that would smack of problem solving or conflict prevention or responding to early warning signs and so forth. Okay, so what might be, and I've got some other things which I should have put up here. I didn't do it. Sorry. I think we need to think much more systemically. And I was talking to Jiang Wen and Tatsurai and so forth the other day. And, I hardly agree with the idea of embedding this sort of Sino-Japanese relationship in a much wider set of, complicated exchanges and trade relationships between Taiwan and South Korea and North Korea and China and USA and so forth. So we need to think much more systemically there. But I think we need to kind of make human security the top priority for the region, by which I mean we need to kind of, in this region, if it's going to be the growth motor for the world economy, it can't be a growth motor for the world economy and then leave huge populations. And in China, for example, it is a huge population, marginalized, unequal, unjustly treated, and have all of the benefits flowing to kind of elite groups and classes in urban areas. Secondly, I think there's a need to kind of confront and deal with negative memory and amplification. Now, problem-solving workshops are one way of doing this, but Jean-Marc Blanchard, is saying, well, there've been huge numbers of sort of exchanges between China and Japan and people-to-people contacts and so forth. So to some extent, contact theory, if you think about what contact theory is supposed to do in terms of overcoming enmity and replacing with friendship, is not doing this for the Chinese situation because of these domestic dynamics and the historic memories and the inability to kind of link the contemporaneous with the historic. And I think this is kind of creating a major challenge for China and Japan. Most of the defense and security specialists say let's focus on natural disasters on a regional basis. So all of the kind of cooperations around dealing with tsunamis and hurricanes and all that kind of stuff, which is important. But that also doesn't get to the heart of these political problems. Then it seems to me that the Chinese miracle is unsustainable at existing levels, both in terms of resource constraints and in terms of environmental protection. So I think it's highly unlikely that it's going to be able to continue the sort of giddy 10, 12, 16% growth rates of the last 20-odd years. And so there's a need for us to kind of think regionally as well as globally about what sustainable development looks like. And then it seems to me that unless we focus on reducing inequality and expanding public goods plus higher levels of political participation in all of these places, then these negative dynamics will keep playing into the politics of fear and manipulation on all sides, both in terms of Tokyo and in terms of Beijing. And this is one of the kind of problems of the 21st century politics. I mean, this, Frank Furedi in The Politics of Fear says, that in the 20th and 21st century, the left have forgotten what kind of future they wish to achieve, and the right has forgotten what kind of past it wishes to conserve, and we're caught in a paralyzing present where we're infantilized, and fear is the political currency. And so when the Chinese activate, Nanjing and the medical experimentation and so forth, then that's what they're doing. They're kind of playing into that fear. And when the Japanese say we've had enough of being accused of being aggressors and barbarians and war criminals, that's activating activating shame. in a face culture. And so, this is part of the problem, and it's bedeviling the United States right now too. I mean, there's absolutely little attention to political discourse. It's all kind of managerial technocracy. And so we've forgotten, that there are some important value issues that underlie, most of these kinds of conversations. And the value issue, I think, which will kind of sabotage and drive rivalry here, has to be an inability to attend to injustice in China, the rural-urban distinctions, and the increasing inability of China to maintain a sort of central control. And that will, if there's a kind of a sense that China starts falling apart, that will then fuel Japanese anxiety as well. So I don't have a lot of solutions. The prospects for peace, in terms of the kind of question, is that the prospects for peace, I think, are possibly good if some of these domestic issues could be addressed, and if the Japanese can figure out a way in which they can mourn for their dead without glorifying the war, and if the Chinese can begin thinking that, in terms of an acknowledgement of the suffering they endured by the Japanese, if they can possibly then begin thinking about that in a more creative way in terms of some more positive options. But in all of this, it seems to me, one of the things that really has to happen is we have to begin thinking of processes, dynamics, and institutions which will enable much more attention to the kind of problems that divide and the commonalities that unite both countries.
Kevin, thank you for a magnificent, fascinating presentation. I am awed and struck by your capitalization of the paralysis afflicting the U.S. Congress with your reference to the political left and political right globally, which applies very profoundly to what's going on in Washington, D.C. I'm also struck by the profound disconnect between objective economic facts and Japanese-Chinese interdependence on the one hand, and on the other hand, deeply rooted psycho-emotional memories of the past on the part of the Chinese and anger on the part of the Japanese, which continue to be portrayed as the aggressor for the last nearly 70 years. And I think the problem-solving folks amongst us would like to know how to bring the disconnect, or those two parts of the disconnect, more together. But they seem to be very, very separate. And your solutions here cry out for being embedded in some sense of theory with regard to causation and with regard to propaganda, which I think can exercise members of our audience and all our students and faculty who are not here but who can watch this online after we end. Before opening up to the audience, I just want to say that your reference to negative peace may not be clear to some people in the audience. So you're negative in a negative sense. Negative peace basically means the absence of war. And that kind of peace is what has ensued in the Asia-Pacific region since the end of World War II. We don't have positive peace, the elimination of those inequalities that Kevin was addressing. So, with that as a little bit of additional background to this fabulous presentation by our guest and former director, let me invite the audience to make some comments, ask some questions before we send Kevin on his way back to the region. Boris Flavia, you're working on historical memory in Eastern Slavonia, Croatia, between Serbs as a minority and Croats as a majority since the genocidal implosion of former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. I'm sure, since I'm the chair of your dissertation committee, you must have heard something in Professor Dr. Clement's presentation that fascinates, interests you. Let me just ask one more question before we wrap up, because I think our time is well beyond what you agreed to do. clearly the United States has a pivotal role to play in Asia, and it hasn't been playing that role too constructively, too effectively. If newly confirmed U.S. Secretary of State, former Senator John Kerry, said, Professor Dr. Clements, you're in the country, you're from the region, you made this great presentation at SCAR. Can you share your thinking with me about what the U.S. should be doing in the region, especially about the Japanese and Chinese getting progressively closer to an unrealistic war that could draw on the U.S. and perhaps, as Gideon Rockland indicated in the Financial Times 3 days ago, would be very similar to the outbreak of World War I. That a war could begin because of alliance commitments, bringing in great powers. What should the U.S. be doing to head that off?
Well, I think that, I think picking up the listening project idea, I think it would be, I think it would send a huge signal around the world if the U.S. simply said it wishes to dispatch a number of emissaries to every single country in the Asia, in East and Southeast Asia and South Asia, to say that we wish to spend the next year listening to needs and aspirations. That may sound a little unrealistic, but I think it would actually, if there was some willingness to do that, and make a public commitment to do that, I think that would actually that would sort of maybe transform some of the dynamics. That may not necessarily be here, just given the desired speed with which things get done around here, it could maybe listen in 6 months. But I think that signaling there was a great desire to listen would be one way of doing it. And another way of doing it would be for the U.S. to, use its good offices and endless connections around the region to sort of say, well, how can we begin having some regional conversations around all of the issues that are on the table? Why shouldn't there be within APEC or in some other regional forum some multilateral discussion of these bilateral issues? They're always steered clear of because they're considered too hard. But after a period of listening, why not try and organize some multilateral conversations, not negotiations, but conversations about, challenges to peace and security in the Asia-Pacific region, and then see what happens. That might result in negotiations, or it might not. But in any event, I think it's a useful exercise. And I would hope that the ASEAN Regional Forum, might be emboldened to take be a little more courageous in relation to fulfilling its role as a conflict preventer. But apart from that, listen.
Unfair, but I just had to ask the question.
Listen.
Thank you very, very, very much. And I thank you all for coming. I thank you for your very critical, constructive questions. And I certainly thank Professor Dr. Kevin Clements, an ICAR former director of Distinction, for coming back home to share his thinking with us at this historical, pivotal point in time. And I hope you write this up, Kevin, if you're not already doing it. To write this up as an article, as a book, maybe initially as an SCAR working paper.
I'm happy to do that.
So let me invite you as your chair. Again, thank you for coming and thank you for us. Bye-bye.